In my home, I have a reprint from an issue of an obscure, short-lived medical journal. The original article was published in 1961. The author, a general practitioner, describes the case of a 29-year-old woman who consulted him in the summer of 1957 after she came down with an unexplained week-long fever. After several days in the hospital and high doses of antibiotics, her fever cleared. The physician didn't see her again until the spring of 1959. By that time, the young woman had delivered a normal full-term baby. She acknowledged during that visit that she hadn't felt very well since the birth. The patient in the article is my mother, and the newborn is me. As a young child in the late 1960s, I spent 2 weeks every summer at my father's parents' home in southeast Mississippi. On the wall of the guest room where I slept every night, a silver frame held a black and white photo of a young woman. Her neat hair, small pearl necklace, and distant gaze made her seem serene and mature. I slept under that photo for several summers before I asked who the lady was. "That was Margie, honey, your mother," my grandmother said. I knew my mother had died when I was very young. I'd always known that. But neither my father nor my stepmother ever spoke voluntarily about her, and I had never seen an image of her. That summer in Hattiesburg, I stared at the frame every night before I went to bed, not knowing whether I should feel more or less about it than I did. My father remarried soon after my mother died. Years later, my parents would proudly confess they had consulted a psychologist for guidance on how to combine two families due to a parent's death. I imagine my stepmother in that doctor's office, sitting uncomfortably on a thin beige sofa, my father next to her in an upright chair. The man in a suit behind a large wooden desk advises them confidently, "Hide all evidence of the deceased. Don't lie about what happened, but don't ever speak about her. Don't even reminisce. You have a new family now. Your children will be better off if you handle it this way." The journal article picks up again in April of 1959, 5 months after my birth. Margie's doctor makes a house call and finds her with chest pain, fever, and arrhythmia. Further examination reveals she has an active heart infection. My mother had had rheumatic fever as a child, so the author concludes that the original illness 2 years before, in 1957, had actually been a recurrence of it. She responds well to another long round of antibiotics. The article ends optimistically. By the summer of 1959, the streptococcus infection of my mother's heart is gone, although she now has a damaged aortic valve. When I was 30 years old, my parents flew out to visit me at my home in San Francisco. One afternoon, we stood on the deck of the Golden Gate Ferry on our way to Sausalito. The ocean air whipped hard as we stood on the outer deck of the boat. "Dad," I said loudly to overcome the wind, "I have a question. I want to know more about Margie. Tell me about her." "Well, son, there's not much to say. She was a lovely person, a lot like your mother here." "She always dressed beautifully," Mom added. "No, Mom, Dad, tell me about why she died." "Well, she had had rheumatic fever from having strep throat as a child," Dad said. He clutched his windbreaker to keep it on his shoulders. "They didn't have antibiotics in those days, you know, and it damaged her heart." "When you were a year old, her heart began failing," Mom said. "They thought surgery was the only option. It was a long time ago, dear. Things were different, and she didn't survive the operation." "Why didn't you ever tell me about it?" I said. "Dad, didn't you think I'd want to know?" "Well, there just wasn't much to say," Dad said. Mom held her hat with her hand to keep it fixed. "Besides," she said, "we didn't want you to feel guilty about it." Guilty about it? I leaned forward to try and hear better. What about it could have made me feel guilty? "Now, Fran," my father said, "no one ever knew for sure that—" Mom interrupted him. "Maurice, I'm just trying to tell him what we know. Your son asked for it." "Francis, you don't know what you're talking about," Dad said. He looked away. The waves continued their angry slap-slap against the side of the ferry. Dad then turned to me. "Her physician wrote an article about her case and sent it to me. If I can find it, you can have it." An endnote written later follows the main body of the journal article. My mother's damaged valve prompted a cardiovascular surgeon to recommend surgical repair. Requiring hypothermia and cardiopulmonary bypass, radical technology in 1960, the surgeons widened the valve, and in the article's words, an extremely good repair was obtained. After the operation, the patient was much improved for several hours. Then she began to have ventricular irritability and runs of tachycardia. 24 hours after surgery, the young woman died. The note concludes that, in retrospect, It was the combination of active rheumatic fever along with the pregnancy with the third child that likely triggered the heart infection and its subsequent damage. The picture of my mother from my grandparents' home is now hanging in our home in South Orange. My 7-year-old son had never asked who the woman in the photo was. He probably thought it was art. One night, sitting in the living room together, me on the sofa, him on the floor, I said, "Isaac, you see that photo on the wall? You want to know who that is? It's my mother." Isaac looked up, confused. "Well, who's Nana then?" "Well, your Nana is my stepmother. My mother died when I was a baby. I never knew her," I said. Isaac reflected for a moment, then climbed onto the sofa next to me, opened his arms wide around my waist, and laid his head on my chest. "That must have been very sad," he said. As I held my son, I looked up at my mother's photo on the wall, wishing I could catch her gaze. I wanted to tell her about her grandson and the words he said to me that I must have waited so long to hear.